The scent of aged oak and freshly planed pine was the balm for my soul, a constant, grounding presence in my workshop. It mingled with the faint, metallic tang of antique tools, each one a silent partner in the meticulous work I devoted my life to. My name is Leo Maxwell. For 47 years, since I first apprenticed under my grandfather, I had dedicated myself to the quiet art of wood, to restoring the intricate bones of historic homes and preserving the integrity of their original design. At 72, my hands, though gnarled with age, still held the precise touch that could coax life back into a dry-rotted beam or reproduce a forgotten molding profile with absolute fidelity. My passion wasn't just for wood. It was for the stories whispered by old structures, the hidden craftsmanship of generations past. Our city, old and layered, was a tapestry of these stories, and for decades, I'd been one of its quiet guardians. But lately, the hum of gentrification had grown into a roar, a relentless, unsettling drone. The latest harbinger of this change was Chloe Sterling. She was a force of nature, a new breed of developer in her late 30s, all sharp angles, polished rhetoric, and a notorious reputation for efficient transformations. Her firm, Sterling Developments, swept through neighborhoods, buying up historic properties not to restore, but to gut, to strip away the soul and replace it with sleek, minimalist, and ultimately interchangeable facades. Her recent acquisition had sent a tremor through the local preservation community. The old Carmichael Mansion, a true architectural gem from the late 19th century, with its distinctive turret, intricate gables, and sprawling verandas. I'd spent months, years even, meticulously cataloging its unique woodworking details for a personal research project, dreaming of a day I might be called to restore its grand staircase. Now it was hers. Her plans, hinted at in hushed tones by nervous realtors, involved a complete overhaul, tearing down interior walls, replacing original windows with cheap vinyl, turning the grand residence into soulless luxury condos. I drove by the mansion almost daily, watching the initial movements. Not restoration crews, but demolition teams, their heavy machinery idling impatiently on the manicured lawns. Chloe herself was often there, a stark figure in a hard hat and designer jeans, gesturing dismissively at architectural marvels, her eyes fixed on something only she could see. Blueprints for a profit margin, not a legacy. I'd overhear snippets from the local coffee shop, the hushed gossip of my neighbors. They say she's going to strip it down to the studs. Heard she got a variance to remove the historic designation. The words tasted like ash. It wasn't just the Carmichael Mansion. It was a pattern. She'd already bought the Old Town Hall, a Greek revival beauty, and turned it into a glass and steel monstrosity that jarred with the entire streetscape. My blood, usually calm as still water, began to stir with a quiet, simmering indignation. This wasn't progress. It was vandalism in the name of profit. This wasn't about building. It was about erasing. My shop, tucked away on a quieter side street, felt like a relic itself, a pocket of resistance. I ran my hand over the smooth, worn surface of my workbench, a piece of timber older than the Carmichael Mansion itself. I thought of the countless hours I'd spent poring over old blueprints, researching historical construction methods, trying to understand the intent of the original builders. Architects were not just draftsmen. They were storytellers, imbuing their creations with purpose. And something in my gut, a deep, professional certainty, told me that Chloe Sterling was about to irrevocably damage a story that wasn't hers to rewrite. The drive home from the Carmichael Mansion became a slow, churning meditation. The usual comfort of my quiet street, the familiar silhouette of my own modestly restored Victorian, felt distant. My mind was still at the mansion, replaying Chloe Sterling's dismissive gestures, her casual disregard for the artistry etched into every cornice and column. That night, sleep was a fleeting, restless thing, punctuated by images of excavators tearing into brick and splintering antique wood. I woke before dawn, the first pale light barely touching the eastern sky, and the decision was already made. I couldn't stand by. My breakfast was cold coffee and a stack of old blueprints. I had a small collection, acquired over decades from various city auctions and discarded architectural firm closures. Among them were a few early sketches of the Carmichael Mansion, done by the original architect, Thomas Carmichael himself, a man whose innovative use of space and light was legendary in our city's history. These weren't the official, finalized plans, but preliminary drawings, intimate glimpses into the creative mind behind the structure. I spread them across my workbench, the familiar scent of ancient ink on linen filling the air. My hands, usually precise, moved with a controlled urgency, tracing lines, scrutinizing faded annotations. I wasn't just looking at the house. I was trying to understand its very intent, its foundational spirit. Chloe Sterling saw only square footage and resale value. I saw a conversation between architect and craftsman, a dialogue across centuries. I pulled out my collection of local historical society journals, cross-referencing dates, studying old city maps. The more I delved, the more a familiar tension began to build in my chest, the quiet hum of a puzzle piece waiting to find its place. The first significant anomaly emerged not from the blueprints, but from a seemingly innocuous entry in an old city council registry I'd unearthed from a dusty box in my attic. It was a brief mention from 1898 concerning the initial construction of the Carmichael Mansion, a special variance granted for its foundations. Due to unforeseen subterranean water flow, the entry read, a unique floating raft foundation system was implemented, requiring specific, limited load-bearing points and a non-negotiable open central courtyard to alleviate pressure. A floating raft foundation. My breath hitched. It was an ingenious, incredibly rare technique for that era, designed to distribute weight evenly over unstable ground, essentially allowing the entire structure to float. But it meant the core of the building, its central courtyard, was not merely an aesthetic choice. It was a crucial structural element, designed to be open, unburdened. Any attempt to build over it, or to add significant weight to the surrounding walls, would compromise the entire system, potentially leading to catastrophic structural failure. I remembered then a small, faded notation on one of Thomas Carmichael's preliminary sketches, courtyard, heart of the house, load-free. It was a simple, poetic instruction, which I had always assumed was purely aesthetic. Now it resonated with a terrifying, beautiful clarity. Chloe's plans for the Carmichael Mansion, as rumored, involved filling in that central courtyard to create additional luxury living space, and adding several new internal walls to partition the vast rooms. Not just aesthetically damaging, but structurally suicidal. My hands trembled slightly as I reread the city council entry, confirming the date, the specific variance number. This wasn't just a hidden detail. It was a ticking time bomb buried in the very foundation of the mansion. A legal stipulation, perhaps even an unrecorded covenant, tied to the original approval. It meant Chloe Sterling's grand, destructive vision was not only an affront to history, but a direct threat to the building itself, one that could be legally and publicly challenged. The air in my workshop, usually so peaceful, now felt charged with a new, urgent purpose. The meeting room at City Hall felt unnaturally cold, despite the late autumn sun streaming weakly through the tall windows. It was one of those austere spaces designed for declarations and decisions, not for the quiet unraveling of historical truths. Across a long, polished oak table sat Chloe Sterling, flanked by a stern-faced corporate attorney and a young, impeccably dressed structural engineer. Chloe exuded her usual confident, almost predatory, energy. Her gaze slid over me and Martha Jensen, dismissing us as an antiquated nuisance. "Let's be efficient, shall we?" Chloe began, her voice crisp, devoid of patience. "We're here to discuss a spurious objection to the Carmichael Mansion revitalization. Our plans are fully permitted, our structural assessments comprehensive." Her attorney gave a tight, superior smile. Martha, seated beside me, simply inclined her head, her expression unreadable. My own hands, resting on the meticulously organized binder of documents, were steady. This wasn't about efficiency for me. It was about integrity. Martha began, her voice calm, professional, outlining our formal objection. She presented the City Council variance from 1898, projecting a faded but perfectly legible scan onto the large screen. The text, dry and bureaucratic, detailed the necessity of the floating raft foundation and the non-negotiable open central courtyard to alleviate pressure. Chloe's structural engineer leaned forward, his brow furrowing slightly, but Chloe herself merely waved a dismissive hand. This is over a century old, Martha. Building codes have evolved. We're using modern engineering. Indeed, Martha countered, her gaze unwavering. But the underlying geological conditions have not. And the foundational design, predicated on those conditions, remains the same. Any significant alteration of the load-bearing points or the central weight distribution would be catastrophic. She paused, then nodded to me. I stood then, walking to the screen. My voice, usually quiet, projected with a clarity born of deep knowledge. Ms. Sterling's plans, as filed, involve filling in the central courtyard to create additional luxury living space and adding several new internal walls to partition the existing grand rooms. I pointed to specific areas on her projected blueprints, then overlaid them with sections of Carmichael's original preliminary sketches. These alterations, I continued, tracing the lines, directly violate the original structural intent. The floating raft foundation is not designed for such concentrated additional load. It would stress the system, leading to uneven settling structural cracks, potentially even a full collapse over time. Chloe's dismissive smile faltered. Her engineer, previously confident, was now flipping through his own binder, his eyes widening. "Mr. Maxwell," he interjected, a tremor in his voice. "Are you asserting the original foundations are still intact to their 1898 specifications?" "I am," I confirmed. "I studied them extensively years ago during an assessment of the subbasement. They are remarkable, but they're also vulnerable to precisely the kind of changes you are proposing." Chloe's face, which had been composed, tightened visibly. "This is outrageous," she snapped, directing her ire at me. "You're an old man clutching at outdated history. My team's assessments are cutting edge." Her attorney leaned in, whispering urgently to her, pointing at something in his own documents. He seemed to have found the variance Martha had mentioned. "Ms. Sterling." Martha cut through the escalating tension, her voice sharp as a freshly sharpened chisel. "The 1898 variance is not just a historical curiosity. It is a legal covenant. Any deviation would not only expose your firm to immense liability for potential structural failure, but also invalidate your building permits, which were granted under the assumption of a compliant foundation." Chloe's gaze, previously dismissive, now fixed on me with a raw, dawning anger. The air crackled with her silent fury. The room went silent, save for the faint hum of the projector. The victory wasn't mine yet, but the first decisive blow had been struck. And the look in Chloe Sterling's eyes told me she finally understood the depth of the story I was telling. It wasn't just about history. It was about the very ground she stood on. The silence that followed Martha's final statement in the City Hall meeting wasn't triumphant, but heavy, charged with the weight of undisputed fact. Chloe Sterling's face was a mask of suppressed fury, her jaw working almost imperceptibly. Her corporate attorney quickly called for a recess, ushering Chloe and her stunned engineer out of the room. As the door clicked shut, the handful of city planning officials and preservation board members who remained looked at each other, then at us, a mixture of shock and quiet respect in their eyes. The battle wasn't won, but the first decisive engagement was undeniably ours. Over the next few days, the reverberations began to spread. The city's building department immediately issued a stop work order on the Carmichael mansion, citing unforeseen structural complexities requiring further review. This wasn't the outright victory we sought, but it was a crucial pause. The massive excavators sat silent on the mansion's lawn, hulking monuments to halted ambition. A strange quiet descended upon the historic district, a collective holding of breath. News outlets, alerted by anonymous tips, I suspected Martha had a hand in that, with her network, picked up the story. Historic mansion threatened by developers' oversight. One headline blared. Centuries-old foundation halts modern renovation. Another declared, detailing the arcane floating raft system. Chloe Sterling's firm, known for its swift, unhindered projects, was suddenly under public scrutiny. The narrative shifted from visionary revitalization to reckless disregard. Chloe's attorney, predictably, sent us a stern letter, attempting to discredit my findings, suggesting my aged memory might be misinterpreting historical data. It was boilerplate legal bluster, easily dismissed by Martha. They tried to frame me as a sentimental obstructionist, but the detailed evidence, cross-referenced with city records and Thomas Carmichael's own archive correspondence, was irrefutable. The quiet strength of documented truth was a formidable shield. The emotional toll, however, was not insignificant. While the community rallied, sending me emails and stopping by the shop with words of encouragement, the sheer scale of Chloe's resources was daunting. Martha warned me that this was just the beginning of a prolonged legal dance. Chloe would try to find every loophole, every angle. She wouldn't surrender easily. There was a sense of perpetual vigilance, a constant tension humming beneath the surface of my days. My hands, usually so steady, sometimes paused in my work, tracing the patterns on an old clock face, lost in thought about the battle ahead. The Carmichael mansion itself stood as a silent witness, its grand facade now partially obscured by scaffolding, a stark reminder of the delicate balance between progress and preservation. I drove by it most evenings, watching the shadows lengthen across its untouched walls, remembering the hidden beauty within. Its fate hung in the balance, a pawn in a larger game. The satisfaction of having exposed Chloe's hubris was tempered by the realization that protecting history often meant an endless vigilance, a constant wrestling with forces that valued only the quantifiable. The most telling sign of Chloe's disarray came from a quiet phone call from a friend on the city planning board. Sterling Developments had formally withdrawn their initial building permits for the mansion. They were re-evaluating their approach. It was a small victory, but a significant one. It meant they couldn't simply bulldozing ahead. They were forced to acknowledge the very foundations they had sought to ignore. The battle for the Carmichael mansion was far from over, but for the first time, it felt like the edifice of history might just stand a fighting chance. The battle for the Carmichael mansion stretched on for another 6 months, a quiet war waged in legal briefs and public hearings. Chloe Sterling, true to Martha's prediction, fought with the relentless energy of a cornered predator. She hired structural engineers who attempted to dismiss my findings, legal teams who tried to bury us in paperwork. But the city council variance, coupled with Thomas Carmichael's own meticulous notes, proved an unbreakable shield. The truth, meticulously uncovered, held firm. Ultimately, Sterling Developments faced a choice: attempt to complete historically accurate restoration that honored the floating raft foundation, or concede defeat and sell the property. The former, given the mansion's condition and the specialized expertise required, would have eaten deeply into their profit margins. The latter meant publicly admitting their profound oversight and losing a significant investment. In the end, facing mounting public pressure and the threat of protracted, reputation-damaging litigation, they chose the latter. The news broke on a crisp spring morning, carried on the local news channels and the front page of the city paper. Sterling Developments sells Carmichael Mansion to Local Preservation Trust. I read the headline in my workshop, the scent of fresh wood shavings in the air, and felt a profound, quiet relief settle over me. The Preservation Trust, a nonprofit dedicated to safeguarding historical properties, had stepped in, securing the mansion with a blend of grant money and private donations. The agreement stipulated that the Carmichael Mansion would be authentically restored, respecting its original architectural intent, and eventually open to the public as a cultural center. My phone rang. It was Martha. Her voice, usually so precise, was filled with a rare, joyful tremor. "We did it, Leo," she said, and I could almost see her tired, brilliant smile. "They're proposing you oversee the restoration. A lead consultant, working with their chief architect. No demolition. No cheap facades. Just honest, painstaking work." I closed my eyes, picturing the mansion, not as Chloe Sterling's empty shell, but as Thomas Carmichael's grand, living creation. A small smile touched my lips. I didn't take the full-time role. My hands, while still capable, reminded me of the decades I'd already poured into this craft. But I accepted the consulting position, agreeing to oversee the most delicate structural elements and to mentor a team of young apprentices who were genuinely passionate about traditional woodworking and architectural history. They came to me, bright-eyed and eager, not with business degrees and projections, but with sketchbooks and a thirst for forgotten knowledge. I taught them how to read the grain of a century-old beam, how to listen to the whispers of a building, how to respect the stories etched into its very foundations. Months later, standing on the newly restored veranda of the Carmichael mansion, watching the sunset cast long shadows across its gleaming facade, I felt a deep, abiding peace. The original wooden details, meticulously repaired or recreated, glowed with their former glory. The central courtyard, now a vibrant garden, remained open to the sky, just as its ingenious architect had intended. Chloe Sterling's name was rarely mentioned, a fading echo in the grand narrative of the mansion. Her legacy was one of thwarted ambition, mine, one of quiet preservation. The true value, I realized, wasn't in grand pronouncements or fleeting profits. It was in the enduring strength of a well-built structure, in the integrity of a preserved story, in the quiet transfer of knowledge from one generation of craftsmen to the next. The work was never truly over, but the foundations, built on respect and truth, were finally secure.